Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a wounded mountain lion that nobody else wants. At a backwoods animal auction in Montana, old trapper Jedediah Cross watches rough men bid on caged creatures. Jed spent 40 years tracking and trapping wild animals for money. But when they drag out a wounded mountain lion, her golden eyes blazing with fight despite her chains, the crowd walks away. Too old, too wild, too broken. Nobody bids. Nobody cares. But Jed sees something in those amber eyes that reminds him of his own trapped soul. He steps forward and puts down his last silver dollars. What happens when two broken spirits find freedom together in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung thick over the Bitterroot Valley like an old man's breath on a cold day. Jedediah Cross sat on the tailgate of his rusted Ford pickup, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 68, his hands bore the scars of 4 decades spent wrestling with the wild, rope burns across his palms, a crooked index finger broken by a bear trap, and knuckles that ached when the weather turned. His weathered leather journal lay open beside him, its pages filled with notes about animal tracks, weather patterns, and the gradual emptying of these mountains. The auction yard sprawled before him like a temporary wound carved into the forest floor. Makeshift pens, constructed from chain link and 2x4s, housed creatures that had no business being caged. Jed counted 3 black bears, a pair of wolves with eyes like winter storms, 2 elk with their antlers sawed short, and a dozen smaller animals that paced their confines with the restless energy of the truly wild. The whole operation stank of desperation and greed, run by men who saw dollar signs where others might see majesty. Jed had driven the 120 miles from his cabin near Glacier National Park, not because he needed anything from this place, but because he'd heard whispers in the towns below. Whispers about animals taken illegally, about permits forged and territories violated. In his younger days, he might have done something about it, reported it to the authorities, maybe even confronted the men running the show. But age had taught him that justice moved slower than bureaucracy, and bureaucracy moved slower than a wounded elk in deep snow. His old leather jacket, the same one he'd worn for 25 years, hung loose on shoulders that had once been broad enough to carry a full-grown buck down a mountainside. The jacket bore its own stories: a tear from barbed wire near Browning, a burn mark from a campfire that got too close, and patches sewn on by Martha's steady hands before the cancer took her 3 years ago. Martha. Even now, the thought of her brought a tightness to his chest that no amount of mountain air could ease. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Pike, who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, called out numbers and descriptions with the enthusiasm of someone selling used farm equipment. His voice carried the particular brand of confidence that came from knowing the law couldn't reach this far into the backcountry, at least not quickly enough to matter. Pike had 2 men working with him, brothers by the look of them, both built like they'd grown up on hard work and harder liquor. They handled the animals with the casual brutality of men who viewed living creatures as inventory. Jed watched a family of raccoons get sold to a man with soft hands and city clothes who probably planned to turn them into some kind of roadside attraction. The bears went to different buyers, their futures uncertain but likely grim. Each transaction felt like a small violence, a severing of something that should have remained whole. He thought about the generations of his family who had lived in these mountains. His grandfather, who'd homesteaded near Whitefish. His father, who'd guided hunters back when the elk herds were thick as summer grass. And himself, the last of the line who'd spent his prime years reducing that same abundance to dollars and cents. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 40 years, Jedediah Cross had been one of the most successful trappers in Montana. He'd known these mountains like a lover knows familiar skin. Every ridge, every hidden valley, every game trail that led to water. His reputation had spread from Kalispell to Great Falls, ranchers called when wolves threatened their livestock. The state hired him to relocate problem bears. Even the federal boys brought him in when they needed someone who could track animals that didn't want to be found. But somewhere along the way, the work had changed. Or maybe he had. It started small, a reluctance to set certain traps, a tendency to drive problem animals deeper into the wilderness rather than putting them down. Martha had noticed it first, the way he'd come home from a job looking like he'd lost something instead of earned something. She'd never said much about it, just squeezed his shoulder and made sure his dinner was warm. Martha understood that some changes in a man happened too slowly to notice until they were complete. The crowd around the auction ring was typical for this kind of operation, a mix of exotic animal dealers, roadside zoo operators, and individuals whose motivations were better left unexamined. Jed recognized a few faces from his trapping days, men who'd aged into harder versions of themselves. They nodded at him with the cautious respect reserved for someone whose reputation preceded them, but nobody approached for conversation. That suited him fine. He hadn't come here to revisit old relationships, or justify his presence to anyone. Young woman with a notebook and the earnest expression of someone who still believed in the power of documentation moved through the crowd, asking questions and taking pictures with a camera that looked expensive. Probably a journalist, maybe an activist. Jed gave her points for courage, but not much for common sense. This wasn't the kind of place where righteous indignation accomplished much beyond getting someone hurt. Pike's men watched her with the casual attention of predators evaluating potential prey. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the operation. More buyers arrived, men in pickup trucks with out-of-state plates. A woman in a Suburban who looked like she ran some kind of private zoo. And a thin man in an expensive jacket who spoke quietly into a cell phone while examining the animals with the calculating gaze of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Jed's attention wandered to the mountain peaks, visible beyond the auction yard. Those peaks had been his cathedral for most of his adult life, their snow-covered summits marking the boundaries of a world that made sense to him. Up there, the rules were simple and ancient. Eat or be eaten, adapt or die, respect the balance or face the consequences. Down here, in the flatter country where humans gathered to conduct their messy business, the rules were murkier and changed according to who had the most money or the loudest voice. His pickup truck held everything he owned that mattered, a few changes of clothes. His trapping gear, though he hadn't used most of it in over a year, Martha's Bible with her handwritten notes in the margins, and a wooden box containing the sum total of his life savings, $843 in mixed bills, and the silver dollars his grandfather had given him on his 18th birthday. Not much to show for a lifetime of work, but enough to keep him fed and sheltered through another winter. Assuming he was careful with it, the coffee in his cup had developed a thin film that spoke to his distraction. Jed had always prided himself on finishing what he started, whether it was tracking a wounded animal or drinking a cup of coffee. But lately, he found himself leaving things incomplete. Half-read books, partially repaired equipment, conversations that trailed off into uncomfortable silence. Martha would have called it grief, but Jed preferred to think of it as a natural settling. Like sediment in a stream finding its proper level after a flood, Pike's voice cut through his reverie, announcing the next item up for bid. Jed looked toward the auction ring and felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. They were bringing out the mountain lion. The cage rolled forward on a makeshift dolly, its metal wheels grinding against the packed earth with a sound like grinding teeth. Inside, the mountain lion lay on her side, flanks rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of labored breathing. Even from 30 feet away, Jed could see the infected wound. Along her right shoulder, a festering reminder of the steel trap that had held her long enough for Pike's men to find her. Here we got ourselves a genuine Montana mountain lion, Pike announced, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of a carnival barker trying to sell tickets to a freak show. Female, probably 8, 9 years old. Been giving the ranchers up near Shoto some trouble, so she's already trapwise and territorial. Perfect for anyone looking to add some authentic Western predator to their collection. The crowd pressed closer to examine the merchandise, but their interest was the calculating kind that measured profit against risk. Jed watched their faces as they took in the animal's condition, the matted fur, the way she held her head at an odd angle that suggested inner ear damage, and the obvious infection that had turned the fur around her shoulder wound a sickly yellow-green. "She's hurt pretty bad," called out a man in coveralls who ran a roadside attraction near Billings. His tone held the disappointment of someone examining damaged goods. "What kind of guarantee you offering if she don't make it through the week?" Pike's laugh had no warmth in it. "This ain't Walmart, boys. You buy her as is, and what happens after that is between you and Providence." The mountain lion's eyes opened then, and Jed felt something in his chest catch like a fishhook finding bone. Those amber eyes held no submission, no defeat, only a wild, burning defiance that spoke of something unbroken at her core. She lifted her head with obvious effort, fixing her gaze on the crowd of humans who'd gathered to decide her fate. The gesture was small but profound, like a flag raised in the face of overwhelming odds. "She's got some fight left in her," observed one of Pike's brothers, prodding the cage with a stick. The mountain lion's response was immediate, a low growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, primal and warning. Several people stepped back involuntarily. "Course, that might not be what you want if you're looking for something manageable." Jed found himself standing before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. His movement caught the attention of those around him, men who knew his reputation and wondered what interest the old trapper might have in a broken predator. He walked closer to the cage, ignoring the murmurs that followed him, until he was near enough to see the gold flecks in the mountain lion's eyes. She watched him approach without the frantic energy she'd shown the others. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended species, the acknowledgement of two creatures who'd spent their lives navigating the brutal mathematics of survival. Jed had looked into the eyes of hundreds of wild animals over the decades, but this was different. This was looking into a mirror that reflected not just his face, but his soul. "What do you think, Jed?" Pike called out, apparently deciding that the old trapper's interest might drum up some competitive bidding. "You looking to add to your collection or just admiring the view?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Jed could feel the weight of every gaze in the crowd, could sense the story already forming in their minds, the famous trapper examining one last prize. But as he stood there looking into those defiant amber eyes, all he could think about was the feeling he'd been carrying for months. A heaviness in his chest that came from knowing he'd spent most of his life on the wrong side of the equation. "She's been through hell," Jed said finally, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended. The crowd fell quiet, waiting for his assessment to continue. "Shoulders infected. Probably hasn't eaten properly in weeks. Most folks looking at her, they're seeing damaged goods." Pike nodded eagerly, sensing an opportunity. "Exactly what I've been telling them. Price should reflect the condition, which is why we're starting the bidding at $50. The number fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. $50 for a life that had roamed these mountains for nearly a decade, that had raised cubs and defended territory and survived winters that would have killed most creatures. The mathematics of it made Jed's stomach turn. "Any takers at 50? Pike's voice had taken on a desperate edge. He'd clearly hoped for more interest, more competition. The roadside attraction operator shook his head and wandered away, apparently deciding that even $50 was too much for an animal that might not live to see next week. Others followed suit, their attention already shifting to more promising prospects. The mountain lion's breathing had grown more labored, and Jed could see a thin line of blood at the corner of her mouth. The infection was worse than it appeared from a distance, and the stress of being caged and transported was taking its toll. If someone didn't take her soon, she'd die right here in this makeshift ring. Just another piece of inventory that hadn't found a buyer. $25, Pike announced, his voice now holding the edge of a man cutting his losses. Surely someone can use her for something, even if it's just the hide. The casual mention of her death, the reduction of this magnificent creature to her mere physical components, hit Jed like a physical blow. He thought about all the mountain lions he'd trapped over the years, all the times he'd delivered them to buyers who saw them as commodities rather than living beings. The weight of those transactions pressed down on him now. 4 decades of choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but felt like betrayals in retrospect. "I'll take her," Jed heard himself say. The words seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, as if spoken by a man he'd never met but had always hoped to become. The crowd turned to look at him with expressions ranging from surprise to confusion. Pike's face lit up with the relief of a man who'd found a buyer for spoiled merchandise. "Well, I'll be damned," Pike said, grinning. "Jed Cross wants himself a broken mountain lion. That'll be $25 and she's all yours." Jed reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his grandfather's wooden box. Inside, cushioned by faded felt, were the 8 silver dollars he'd carried for 50 years, a gift from a man who'd believed in the possibility of second chances. His fingers trembled slightly as he counted out the equivalent in bills, leaving the silver dollars untouched. Some things were too precious to spend, even for this. As he handed over the money, the mountain lion's eyes found his again. This time, he saw something different in that golden gaze. Not gratitude, because wild things didn't trade in human emotions, but perhaps a recognition that the terms of her captivity had changed. She was still caged, still wounded, still facing an uncertain future. But she was no longer alone. The transaction was complete in moments, Pike pocketing the bills and gesturing for his brothers to help load the cage into Jed's pickup. As they worked, the mountain lion never took her eyes off her new owner, and Jed found himself making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, promises about healing and freedom, and finding a way to make amends for a lifetime of taking. Without giving back, the crowd had already moved on to the next item, their brief interest in the broken predator forgotten. But for Jed, everything had changed in those few moments of decision. He'd crossed a line he hadn't even known existed, stepping from one version of himself into another. And as he watched them secure the cage in his truck bed, he realized that buying the mountain lion's freedom might be the first truly honest thing he'd done in years. The drive back to his cabin took Jed through country he'd known since childhood, but every familiar landmark now seemed to carry new weight. The mountain lion lay quiet in the cage behind him, her breathing shallow but steady. Every few miles, he found himself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to find her dead, half hoping to see some sign that her condition was improving. What he saw instead was those amber eyes, always watching, always alert, despite her obvious pain. His cabin sat on 40 acres of timber and meadow that backed up against national forest land. Jed had built most of it himself during the early years of his marriage, when Martha was still convinced she could civilize him, and he was still young enough to believe that a man could have everything he wanted if he worked hard enough. The cabin was solid but not fancy. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and a workshop where Jed had spent countless winter hours repairing traps and crafting the tools of his trade. Behind the main cabin stood a series of outbuildings that told the story of his 40-year career. There was the smokehouse where he'd cured countless hides, the storage shed filled with traps he no longer used, and 3 sturdy pens he'd built for temporarily holding animals before transport. The pens had been designed with security in mind, chain link topped with barbed wire, concrete foundations that prevented digging, and heavy-duty locks that could withstand the desperate strength of caged predators. Looking at those pens now, Jed felt a familiar tightness in his chest. How many animals had he held in those enclosures over the years? How many wild things had paced those boundaries, wearing paths in the earth with their restless energy? The pens were well-built and escape-proof, which had always been a source of professional pride. Now they felt like monuments to his own moral blindness. He backed the truck up to the largest pen and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Moving the mountain lion from the auction cage to his holding pen would require careful planning. She was wounded and weak, but desperation could make even the most injured animal dangerous. Jed had learned that lesson the hard way more than once, bearing scars from creatures who'd found strength they didn't know they possessed when freedom was within reach. The evening light filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jed climbed out of the truck and approached the cage slowly, speaking in the low, steady voice he'd always used with frightened animals. The mountain lion's ears swiveled toward the sound, but her eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the cage walls, as if she were looking through him to the forest beyond. "Easy there. Girl," Jed murmured, examining the cage's latch mechanism. "I know this isn't what you want, but we need to get that shoulder looked at before we can think about anything else." The mountain lion's response was a soft growl that seemed more conversational than threatening. Up close, Jed could see the full extent of her injuries. The shoulder wound was worse than he'd thought, deep and infected, with the kind of angry red edges that spoke of serious tissue damage. Her left ear had been torn, probably during her struggle to escape the trap, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes along her flanks that suggested she'd fought hard before being captured. But it was her weight loss that concerned him most. The mountain lion was probably 20 pounds lighter than she should be, her ribs visible beneath her tawny coat. She'd been trapped for weeks, maybe longer, slowly starving while the infection ravaged her strength. The fact that she was still alive spoke to a will that impressed even someone who'd spent his life dealing with wild animals. Jed opened the gate to his holding pen and began the delicate process of transferring his new responsibility. The auction cage was designed to be portable rather than secure, and he was able to position it so that the mountain lion could walk directly into the larger enclosure without giving her a chance to escape. The process took nearly an hour, with Jed moving slowly and speaking constantly, trying to project calm confidence while his heart hammered against his ribs. When the transfer was finally complete, Jed stepped back and watched the mountain lion explore her new surroundings. She moved stiffly, favoring her injured shoulder, but there was purpose in her movements. She tested the fence line, examined every corner, and located the water trough he'd filled that morning. Only when she'd completed her reconnaissance did she settle into the corner farthest from the gate, positioning herself where she could watch both entrances while keeping her back to the solid wall. The intelligence behind those amber eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just an animal. This was a strategist, a survivor who understood the rules of captivity and was already planning her response to them. Jed found himself wondering what she'd been like before the trap, when she was free to roam hundreds of square miles of mountain territory. Had she had cubs, a mate? How long had she ruled her section of the wilderness before human interference reduced her to this, a wounded predator in a chain-link cage? Night was falling, and with it came the familiar sounds of the mountain evening, the distant call of loons from the lake, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The mountain lion lifted her head at these sounds, her ears turning like radar dishes as she catalogued the voices of a world she could hear but no longer fully access. Jed sat on his porch steps, nursing a cup of coffee and watching his unexpected guest. The rational part of his mind was already calculating costs, veterinary bills, food expenses, the modifications he'd need to make to keep a mountain lion healthy and secure. The emotional part was asking harder questions about what he'd really committed to when he'd placed that $25 bid. In the fading light, he pulled out Martha's Bible and opened it to a passage she'd marked years ago. Her handwriting in the margin was still clear. Sometimes God's mercy comes disguised as an inconvenience. Martha had written those words during his heaviest drinking period, when his grief over their childlessness had driven him to seek answers at the bottom of whiskey bottles. She'd never spoken the words aloud, but he'd found the notation months later and understood her message. Looking at the mountain lion now, this magnificent, broken creature who'd somehow become his responsibility, Jed wondered if Martha had been more prophetic than either of them had realized. This felt like mercy, but it also felt like the most inconvenient thing he'd ever done. At 68, with limited funds and no clear plan, he'd committed himself to healing a creature that might never trust him, might never recover, and might always see him as just another captor in a series of cages. But as the stars appeared overhead and the mountain lion settled into whatever passed for sleep in her new prison, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. For the first time since Martha's death, he had something that needed him, something that depended entirely on his choices and his care. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: finding a veterinarian willing to treat a wild predator, figuring out the proper diet and care routine, and beginning the long process of healing that would have to happen before any talk of freedom could make sense. But tonight, under the vast Montana sky, an old trapper and a wounded mountain lion shared the same small piece of earth, each learning to navigate the strange territory of unexpected grace. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen her share of unusual cases in 15 years of veterinary practice, but the phone call from Jedediah Cross was a first. She'd heard of the old trapper, his reputation extended well beyond the small community of whitefish, but she'd never expected him to call, asking for help with a wounded mountain lion he'd apparently rescued from some kind of auction. "I'll be straight with you, Doc," Jed had said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood he was asking for something extraordinary. "She's in bad shape. Infected shoulder wound, probably hasn't eaten properly in weeks. I know it's not a normal house call, but I'm hoping you might make an exception." Sarah had made that exception, partly because the alternative was letting a wild animal suffer, and partly because something in the old man's voice suggested this wasn't just about veterinary care. She arrived at Jed's cabin early the next morning, her truck loaded with antibiotics, surgical supplies, and the portable X-ray equipment she'd borrowed from a colleague who specialized in zoo animals. The mountain lion was everything Jed had described and worse. Sarah examined her from outside the pen first, noting the obvious infection, the labored breathing, and the way the animal held herself that suggested significant pain. But she also noted the alertness in those amber eyes, the way the mountain lion tracked every movement, with the focused attention of a predator who hadn't given up. "She's going to need surgery," Sarah announced after her initial assessment. "That shoulder wound goes deeper than it looks, and there's probably foreign material in there, pieces of the trap, dirt, maybe fabric from whatever they used to transport her. Without proper treatment, the infection will kill her within a week." Jed had expected as much, but hearing it stated so plainly still hit him like a physical blow. "What are we looking at cost-wise?" Sarah's pause told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. Surgery, antibiotics, follow-up care, probably $1,500 minimum. Maybe more if there are complications. The number hung between them like a bridge too far to cross. Jed's entire savings amounted to less than $900, and that had to last him through the winter. But looking at the mountain lion, seeing the way she struggled with each breath, he found himself doing the same mathematics that had led him to buy her freedom in the first place. "Some things couldn't be measured in dollars. Let's do it," he said simply. The operation took place right there in the pen, with Sarah working under portable lights while Jed assisted, and the mountain lion lay unconscious under anesthesia. Sarah's skill was evident in the careful way she cleaned the wound, removing pieces of steel and infected tissue with the precision of someone who understood that this animal's life hung in the balance of every decision. "She's lucky you found her," Sarah murmured as she worked. "Another few days, and this infection would have gone systemic. Even now, it's going to be touch and go for the next week." As Sarah sutured the wound closed, Jed found himself studying the mountain lion's face in repose. Without the wariness and pain that had marked her expression, he could see the noble lines of her features, the powerful build that had once made her the apex predator in hundreds of square miles of wilderness. She was beautiful in the way that only truly wild things could be, not pretty or decorative, but possessed of a fierce elegance that spoke to something fundamental about the world's remaining untamed places. The recovery period proved more challenging than either Jed or Sarah had anticipated. The mountain lion's refusal to eat was their first major obstacle. Despite Jed's offerings of fresh deer meat, fish from the local streams, and even commercially prepared big cat food that cost him $30 a bag, she remained stubbornly uninterested in food. Her water consumption was minimal, and she spent most of her time lying in the corner of the pen, those amber eyes tracking every movement but revealing nothing of her internal state. "She's depressed," Sarah explained during one of her follow-up visits. "It's more common than people think in captive wild animals." The combination of injury, confinement, and separation from familiar territory can create a kind of psychological shutdown. Some animals never come out of it. The possibility that the mountain lion might simply choose to die rather than accept her circumstances hadn't occurred to Jed. But once Sarah mentioned it, he could see the signs. There was something defeated in the way she lay, something that spoke of a spirit gradually withdrawing from a world that had become too small and too controlled to sustain her interest. That night, Jed made a decision that went against every principle of safe animal handling he'd learned in 4 decades of trapping. He entered the pen. The mountain lion's response was immediate, a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by the sight of her struggling to rise despite her injuries. But instead of backing away, Jed sat down cross-legged about 10 feet from her, close enough that she could reach him in 2 bounds if she chose to, far enough that he wasn't presenting an immediate threat. "I know this isn't what you want," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hell, it's not what I want either. But we're both stuck with circumstances we didn't choose, and maybe that means we can find some way to get through this together." The mountain lion's growl gradually faded, though her muscles remained tensed for flight or fight. Jed continued talking, telling her about the mountains beyond the pen, about the territory she'd once roamed, about his own complicated relationship with these wild places that had defined his life. He spoke about Martha, about the gradual realization that he'd spent most of his adult life on the wrong side of the equation between civilization and wilderness. An hour passed, then 2. The mountain lion never relaxed completely, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle acknowledgement that this human was different from the others, that his presence in her space came with different rules and intentions. When Jed finally stood to leave, moving slowly and keeping his voice soft, she didn't growl. She watched him go with what might have been curiosity instead of pure hostility. The next morning, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, the mountain lion ate. Not much, just a few bites of the venison Jed had left for her, but enough to suggest that something fundamental had changed. Sarah, examining her later that day, found that the surgical site was healing cleanly and that her overall condition showed signs of improvement. "Whatever you're doing," Sarah told Jed as she packed up her equipment, "keep doing it." She's turned a corner, but Jed knew it wasn't that simple. The mountain lion was surviving, possibly even healing, but she was still a wild predator in a chain-link cage. The question that kept him awake at night wasn't whether she would recover, it was what recovery would mean for both of them. At some point, if she healed completely, he would have to make a choice between her continued captivity and her freedom. And he was beginning to suspect that choice would define not just her future, but the kind of man he would be for whatever years remained to him. 3 weeks into the mountain lion's recovery, Jed's routine had settled into a rhythm that revolved entirely around her needs. He rose before dawn to check on her condition, prepared her meals with the same attention Martha used to give to Sunday dinners, and spent at least an hour each evening sitting quietly outside her pen, talking to her about everything and nothing. The veterinary bills had eaten through most of his savings, leaving him with barely enough money to last through the winter. But the mountain lion, whom he'd started calling Sierra, though he'd never spoken the name aloud, was steadily improving. Her appetite had returned with surprising vigor. She now consumed nearly 10 pounds of meat per day, a requirement that forced Jed to become creative about procurement. His hunting skills, dormant for months, reasserted themselves as he tracked deer and elk through the familiar mountains, but now with a different purpose. Where once he'd hunted for sport or to thin problem herds, he now hunted to feed a creature whose survival had become the organizing principle of his life. The physical changes in Sierra were dramatic. Her coat had regained its lustrous quality, the dull, matted fur replaced by the golden-brown magnificence that marked her as one of the mountain's premier predators. The surgical site had healed cleanly, leaving only a thin line of scar tissue as evidence of her ordeal. Her weight was returning, though she remained leaner than ideal, and her movements had regained much of their fluid grace. But it was the psychological changes that fascinated and troubled Jed most. Sierra had developed a complex relationship with captivity that seemed to shift daily. Some mornings, he'd find her pacing the perimeter of the pen with the restless energy of a creature measuring the boundaries of her prison. Other days, she seemed almost content, lying in the morning sun or watching the forest beyond her enclosure with what appeared to be peaceful contemplation rather than desperate longing. Their evening conversations had become a ritual that both seemed to anticipate. Jed would arrive with a cup of coffee and whatever book he was reading, settle into his chair outside her pen and begin talking. Sometimes he read aloud, poetry that Martha had loved, passages from novels about the Old West, even wildlife management articles from magazines he'd accumulated over the years. Other times, he simply talked about his day, his memories, or his growing uncertainty about what the future held for both of them. Sierra's responses were subtle but unmistakable. She would position herself where she could see him clearly, her amber eyes focused on his face with an attention that seemed to go beyond mere wariness. Occasionally, she would respond to something he said with a soft chuff or a tilt of her head that suggested comprehension, if not agreement. Most remarkably, she had stopped growling when he entered her line of sight, replacing hostility with what could only be described as recognition. The change in their relationship became clear the day Jed discovered Sierra's den box. He'd noticed her spending increasing amounts of time in the wooden shelter he'd built in one corner of the pen. But when he approached to check on her one morning, he found something that stopped him in his tracks. There, arranged in a careful circle around her resting spot, were small objects she'd somehow acquired: a pine cone that had blown into her enclosure, a piece of colorful plastic from an old feed bag, and most significantly, a leather glove that Jed had dropped near her pen a week earlier and assumed was lost. The arrangement was deliberate, purposeful. Sierra had created something that served no survival function, but seemed to fulfill some deeper need for order and familiarity. When she saw Jed observing her collection, she didn't retreat or show defensiveness. Instead, she seemed to be presenting it to him, as if seeking his acknowledgement of this small assertion of her identity within the confines of captivity. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Tom Brennan, the local game warden, drove up in his official vehicle with the kind of determined expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. Jed had known Tom for 15 years and respected him as one of the few government employees who understood the difference between enforcing the law and serving justice. But the sight of that uniform still made his stomach tighten. "Heard you might have acquired yourself some unusual livestock," Tom said without preamble, his eyes scanning the property until they located the pen where Sierra lay. Watching this new development with obvious interest, Jed considered his options. He could deny ownership, claim he was just providing temporary care, or construct any number of half-truths that might buy him time. Instead, he found himself telling the complete story: the auction, his impulsive decision to buy Sierra's freedom, the veterinary care, and his growing realization that he'd committed himself to something far more complex than simple animal rescue. Tom listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Jed finished, the game warden walked over to Sierra's pen and studied its occupant for several long minutes. Sierra, for her part, returned his scrutiny with the calm dignity of a queen receiving a foreign ambassador. "She looks healthy," Tom observed finally. "Whoever's been caring for her knows what they're doing." "Dr. Chen's been handling the medical side," Jed replied. "I just provide the room and board." Tom's smile was thin. "Room and board for a mountain lion requires federal permits, state licensing, and about 40 different forms of documentation you don't have. You know that?" The statement hung between them like a loaded trap. Jed had known from the beginning that his arrangement with Sierra existed in a legal gray area at best. Mountain lions were protected species in Montana, and keeping one in captivity without proper permits was a federal offense that could result in significant fines and even imprisonment. "What are you going to do about it?" Jed asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching Sierra as she moved to the water trough with the fluid grace that marked her as something fundamentally different from domestic animals. "Officially, I'm going to file a report, noting that I investigated rumors of illegal wildlife possession and found no evidence to support the claims. Unofficially, I'm going to suggest you start thinking about long-term solutions that don't involve keeping a mountain lion in your backyard indefinitely." Relief and anxiety warred in Jed's chest. "What kind of solutions?" "There are wildlife sanctuaries that specialize in big cats, places with proper facilities and legal standing to provide lifetime care for animals that can't be released. It wouldn't be freedom, but it would be legal, and it might be better than this." The suggestion was reasonable, practical, and utterly devastating. Jed looked at Sierra, who had settled back into her favorite spot where she could observe both men while maintaining her dignity. The idea of loading her into another cage, driving her to another facility where she'd become one more rescued animal in someone else's care, felt like a betrayal of everything their relationship had become. But Tom's warning was clear. Sierra's current situation was temporary by legal necessity. Either Jed found a solution that satisfied the various regulatory agencies, or those agencies would find their own solution, one that might not prioritize Sierra's well-being over bureaucratic convenience. That night, as Jed sat with Sierra during their usual evening session, he found himself talking about choices and consequences, about the difference between what was legal and what was right, and about the weight of responsibility for another creature's life. Sierra listened with her usual attention, but Jed thought he detected something new in her expression, not just recognition, but expectation, as if she understood that their current arrangement was approaching some kind of resolution. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a postal worker who seemed eager to complete her business and leave. The envelope bore the official seal of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and its contents confirmed Jed's worst fears. He had 30 days to either obtain proper permits for keeping Sierra or surrender her to state custody for relocation to an approved facility. The bureaucratic language was precise and unforgiving. Sierra was classified as unlawfully possessed wildlife, and Jed as someone maintaining illegal custody of a protected species. The letter outlined penalties that could include substantial fines and up to 6 months in jail, though it also offered a path to compliance through a process that would require extensive documentation, facility inspections, and fees that exceeded his entire remaining savings. Jed read the letter 3 times, each reading confirming what he already knew. The system had no framework for what he was trying to do. The regulations were designed for zoos, research facilities, and commercial operations, not for an old trapper trying to heal a wounded animal he'd rescued from an illegal auction. The irony wasn't lost on him that Pike's operation had been shut down the week after Sierra's sale, but only after its damage was done. That evening, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived for Sierra's final checkup with news that was both encouraging and devastating. Sierra had made a complete physical recovery, Her weight was optimal, her coat gleamed with health, and the surgical site showed no signs of complications. From a medical standpoint, she was ready for whatever came next. "She's magnificent," Sarah said, watching Sierra navigate her enclosure with fluid grace. "You've done something remarkable here, Jed. When I first saw her, I wasn't sure she'd survive the week. Now look at her." But the pride in Sarah's voice was tempered by the reality they both understood. Sierra's physical recovery was complete, but her situation remained impossible. She was a wild predator who had been healed back to full strength, and then confined to a space barely larger than a suburban backyard. Every day of her captivity now represented a choice between her safety and her nature. What would happen if she was released? Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah's expression grew grave. "Honestly, she'd probably be fine physically. Her hunting instincts are intact, she knows this territory, and she's proven she can survive harsh conditions. But there's no legal framework for releasing her. She's been in human custody, which means she's automatically classified as potentially dangerous to public safety. If she was spotted after release, she'd be tracked down and destroyed." The conversation was interrupted by Sierra herself, who had approached the fence line where they stood talking. This was unusual. She typically maintained her distance from visitors, observing them from the security of her shelter. But now she stood less than 3 feet away, her amber eyes moving between Jed and Sarah with what appeared to be deliberate attention to their discussion. "It's like she knows," Sarah murmured. "Like she understands what we're talking about." Jed had noticed Sierra's increased attentiveness over the past week. The way she seemed to be studying not just her environment, but the people who moved through it. There was something in her behavior that suggested she was preparing for change, though whether that preparation was conscious or instinctual was impossible to determine. The next morning brought another visitor, Jake Morrison, a representative from the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Sanctuary in Colorado. Tom Brennan had apparently made some calls, and Jake had driven up to evaluate Sierra's situation and discuss relocation options. He was a competent, caring professional who clearly understood big cats and spoke knowledgeably about habitat requirements, enrichment protocols, and the psychological needs of captive predators. "We have a 40-acre enclosure specifically designed for mountain lions," Jake explained as he observed Sierra from outside her pen. "Natural terrain, running water, plenty of vertical space for climbing. She'd have companionship too. We have 2 other mountain lions, both rescues like her." The sanctuary sounded ideal in every practical sense. Sierra would have legal protection, expert care, and a vastly improved quality of life. She would live out her natural lifespan in safety and relative comfort, far better than most captive wild animals could hope for. It was the rational solution, the responsible choice, the outcome that served everyone's interests. But as Jake continued describing the facility, Jed found himself watching Sierra's face. Those amber eyes held an expression he'd learned to read over the past month, the look of an animal measuring distances, calculating possibilities, evaluating options that others couldn't see. She wasn't listening to Jake's description of her potential new home with the passive attention of a creature accepting whatever fate others chose for her. She was listening like someone forming her own plans. That night, alone with Sierra during their usual evening session, Jed found himself talking about freedom and captivity, about the difference between safety and living, about choices that had no good answers. Sierra listened with her customary attention, but something in her posture suggested she was no longer just listening, she was waiting. The realization came to Jed gradually, like dawn, breaking over familiar mountains. Sierra wasn't just healing from her physical injuries. She was preparing for something. The increased alertness, the way she'd been testing the fence line, the deliberate attention she paid to every human conversation in her presence. These weren't the behaviors of an animal accepting permanent captivity. They were the behaviors of an animal biding her time. 2 days before Jake Morrison was scheduled to return with transport arrangements, Jed made a discovery that changed everything. He found a section of fence where Sierra had been systematically working at the chain link, using her claws to gradually weaken the metal at ground level. The damage was subtle, nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look, but it was definitely deliberate. Sierra had been planning her own solution to the problem of her captivity. The discovery forced Jed to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. Sierra had never accepted her situation as permanent. Even while healing, even while developing what seemed like a relationship with her captor, she had been preparing to reclaim her freedom on her own terms. The fence work represented weeks of patient effort, conducted so carefully that even someone who watched her daily had missed it. Standing there in the grey morning light, examining the evidence of Sierra's determination, Jed realized that he faced a choice that would define not just her future, but his own understanding of what it meant to truly care for another living being. He could repair the fence, increase security, and deliver her to the sanctuary as planned. Or he could acknowledge that some things were more important than safety, more valuable than good intentions, more necessary than the approval of well-meaning officials who had never looked into the eyes of a mountain lion and seen their own soul reflected back. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really about Sierra at all. It was about what kind of man Jedediah Cross would choose to be in the time he had left, and whether he had the courage to honor the trust that had somehow developed between a broken trapper and a mountain lion who refused to be broken. The truth came to him in pieces, like fragments of a photograph scattered by wind and slowly reassembled by patient hands. It started with something Dr. Sarah Chen mentioned during what was supposed to be Sierra's final examination before transport to the sanctuary. "It's interesting," Sarah said, making notes on her chart. "I've been thinking about her initial injuries, and something doesn't quite add up. The pattern of the trap wounds, the way they healed, they're not consistent with a standard leg hold trap like Pike claimed." Jed looked up from where he'd been watching Sierra pace her enclosure with increasing restlessness. "What do you mean?" "Well, leg hold traps create specific types of injuries. Crushing damage usually focused on the bones and joints. But Sierra's wounds were more like puncture injuries, deeper but more precise. And the location is wrong too high on the shoulder for a ground-based trap." Sarah's observation nagged at Jed throughout the day, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. That night, unable to sleep, he pulled out the wooden box that contained his few precious possessions and withdrew an item he hadn't looked at in months, Martha's magnifying glass, which she'd used for reading after her eyesight began to fail. Using the magnifying glass and a flashlight, Jed examined Sierra's scars more closely than he'd ever done before. What he saw made his blood run cold. The scar pattern wasn't random. It was too regular, too deliberate. These weren't the chaotic wounds of an animal struggling against a trap. They were systematic puncture marks, the kind made by a specific tool used by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Those weren't trap wounds. They were dart wounds. Multiple tranquilizer darts that had been allowed to fester rather than being properly treated. Someone had shot Sierra with enough tranquilizers to bring her down, then left the puncture wounds to become infected while she was held in captivity somewhere else. Jed's hands shook as he reached for his old trapping journal, flipping through pages of notes and contacts until he found what he was looking for: Pike's real name and the information he'd gathered years ago when the man first started operating in the region. Pike wasn't just running illegal auctions. He was part of something much bigger and more sinister. The next morning, Jed drove to the small town of Eureka, where the local librarian helped him access newspaper archives and internet records he couldn't navigate on his own. What he found painted a picture that made him sick to his stomach. Pike's operation was connected to a network of wildlife trafficking that stretched across multiple states. They weren't just opportunistically selling animals that had been problematically trapped. They were actively hunting and capturing healthy animals for sale to private collectors. Roadside attractions and worse. The most damning piece of evidence came from a Fish and Wildlife Service bulletin that was 3 months old. Sierra wasn't just any mountain lion. She was a specific animal that had been reported missing from Glacier National Park, where researchers had been tracking her as part of a long-term study. She had been collared and monitored for over 2 years, documented as a successful mother who had raised 3 litters of cubs to maturity. She was one of the park's most successful breeding females, a cornerstone of the local mountain lion population. According to the report, Sierra, identified by researchers as female 47, had simply vanished from the study area in late spring. Her tracking collar had been found damaged and abandoned near a remote access road, leading researchers to assume she had died from natural causes or been killed by another predator. They had never suspected that she might have been captured and sold at an illegal auction, but there was more. The research files contained photographs of Sierra in her natural habitat, images that showed her with her most recent litter of cubs. 3 young mountain lions, probably 6 months old when their mother disappeared. Cubs that were too young to survive on their own, too dependent on their mother's hunting skills and protection to make it through a Montana winter alone. Jed stared at those photographs until his eyes burned. Sierra hadn't just been a random wild animal caught in an unfortunate situation. She had been a mother, stolen from cubs who needed her. Her desperate attempts to escape the tranquilizer darts, her fierce resistance to captivity, her restless pacing in the pen, it all took on new meaning. She hadn't just been fighting for her own freedom. She had been fighting to get back to babies who were probably already dead. The weight of this revelation settled on Jed's shoulders like a physical burden. Every kindness he'd shown Sierra, every hour of care, every moment of their developing relationship was built on a foundation of ignorance about the true scope of her loss. He had been proud of himself for saving her, for nursing her back to health, for giving her a chance at recovery. But he had never understood that his small act of mercy couldn't begin to address the magnitude of what had been taken from her. That evening, Jed sat outside Sierra's pen with the research photographs spread before him. In one image, she stood on a rocky outcrop with her 3 cubs visible behind her, 2 males and a female, all showing the distinctive markings that would have identified them as her offspring. In another, she was teaching them to hunt, their young bodies mimicking her movements with the concentrated attention that marked the difference between play and survival education. "I'm sorry," Jed said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I thought I was helping you, but I didn't understand what you'd lost." Sierra approached the fence line, closer than she'd come in weeks. She stood there looking at him with those amber eyes that he now understood held not just the wildness of an untamed predator, but the grief of a mother who'd been torn away from her children. For the first time since he'd brought her home, she made a sound, not a growl or a warning, but a low, mournful vocalization that seemed to come from someplace deeper than her throat. The sound cut through Jed like a blade. This wasn't just about a wounded animal anymore. This was about a mother who had been stolen from her babies, who had fought desperately to return to them, who had endured weeks of captivity and infection while her cubs starved somewhere in the wilderness. Every day of her recovery had been another day further from any possibility of reuniting with her offspring. Jed looked at the government letter that still sat on his kitchen table, with its 30-day ultimatum and its bureaucratic solutions. He thought about Jake Morrison's well-intentioned sanctuary, with its 40-acre enclosure and its promise of safety and companionship with other rescued mountain lions. All of it, every legal, responsible, rational option, ignored the fundamental truth that Sierra wasn't just a wild animal in need of care. She was a mother whose children had been condemned to death by the greed of men like Pike. The photographs in his hands told a story that transformed everything he thought he understood about his situation. Sierra's fence work wasn't just an escape attempt. It was a mother's desperate effort to get back to her cubs, even though logic suggested they were already beyond saving. Her restlessness, her refusal to truly settle into captivity, her constant attention to the sounds and scents of the forest beyond her pen, it all made terrible, Heartbreaking sense now, standing there in the gathering darkness, holding evidence of Sierra's lost motherhood. Jed finally understood the real choice that faced him. It wasn't between legal compliance and illegal defiance, between safety and risk, between rational solutions and sentimental gestures. It was between honoring the full truth of who Sierra was and accepting a diminished version of her story that made everyone else feel better about an impossible situation. The mountain lion who stood before him wasn't just a rescued animal or a magnificent predator or even a fellow creature seeking freedom. She was a mother who had lost everything that mattered to her, and who deserved the chance to mourn that loss in the mountains where her children had been born, even if she could never find them again. We got word that someone's been asking questions about female 47, Tom said, without preamble. Federal boys caught wind of Pike's operation after it got shut down. They're putting together a task force to track down every animal that went through that auction, and they're starting to connect some dots. Tom's expression grew more serious as he continued. They know about the research cat that went missing from Glacier. They know Pike had her, and they're going to start knocking on doors, asking hard questions about where she ended up. You've got maybe 48 hours before this place gets a visit that won't be as friendly as mine. The warning hit Jed like a physical blow. The bureaucratic letter with its 30-day ultimatum had been replaced by a much more immediate timeline. Federal wildlife agents wouldn't be satisfied with promises to relocate Sierra to a sanctuary. They would want documentation, explanations, and probably prosecution of everyone involved in the illegal auction chain. What are you suggesting? Jed asked. Though he suspected he already knew, Tom glanced toward Sierra's pen, where she stood watching their conversation with the alert attention that marked her as something fundamentally different from domestic animals. I'm suggesting that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. And I'm suggesting that I won't be back this way for at least a week, which means I won't know about anything that might happen while I'm gone. The implication was clear. Tom was offering Jed a window of opportunity, a brief period where official oversight would be absent. What Jed chose to do with that window was his own decision. But Tom was making it clear that there would be no interference from local law enforcement. After Tom left, Jed spent the day in preparation that felt like both planning and prayer. He inventoried his supplies, checked his equipment, and made arrangements that assumed he might not return to his cabin for an extended period. The decision that had been building for weeks was now crystallizing into action, driven by the twin pressures of federal investigation and the possibility that Sierra's cubs might still be alive. That evening, during what might be their final conversation, Jed told Sierra everything. He spoke about the research that had identified her true identity, about the cubs she'd lost, about the possibility that at least one of them might have survived in the territory she knew better than any human ever could. He told her about the federal agents who would arrive soon, about the sanctuary that waited for her in Colorado, about the choice that faced both of them in the hours that remained. Sierra listened with the focused attention she'd always shown during their evening sessions. But something in her posture suggested that this time was different. She moved restlessly along the fence line, testing sections she'd never examined before, her behavior carrying the energy of an animal preparing for significant action. The tools Jed would need for what came next were already assembled in his workshop. Wire cutters that could handle chain link, a portable animal carrier that could be loaded into his truck, emergency supplies for an extended stay in the wilderness, and his grandfather's compass that had guided him through these mountains for 50 years. Everything was ready, except his courage. As midnight approached, Jed made his final preparations. He loaded his truck with everything they might need for a journey into Sierra's former territory: camping gear, food supplies, medical kit, and the GPS coordinates that marked the locations where her cubs were most likely to shelter if they were still alive. The risk was enormous. If the federal agents arrived and found Sierra gone, Jed would become a fugitive. If they got lost in the wilderness, both he and Sierra could die in country that showed no mercy to the unprepared. If Sierra's cubs were already dead, he would have destroyed both their lives for nothing. But as he stood outside Sierra's pen in the pre-dawn darkness, watching her pace with the restless energy of a predator who sensed change approaching, Jed realized that the choice had already been made. It had been made the moment he'd seen those photographs of Sierra with her cubs, the moment he'd understood that she wasn't just a rescued animal, but a mother dealing with unimaginable loss. The wire cutters felt heavy in his hands as he approached the section of fence where Sierra had been working. In a few hours, Jake Morrison would arrive to transport her to a sanctuary where she would live out her natural lifespan in safety and comfort. In a few days, federal agents would close the investigation and file their reports about the recovery of stolen wildlife. Everyone would feel satisfied that justice had been served and that Sierra had been given the best possible outcome. Everyone except Sierra herself, who deserved the chance to search for her children in the mountains where they had been born, even if that search ended in heartbreak, even if it ended in death, even if it meant that an old trapper and a grieving mountain lion would face the wilderness together, carrying nothing but hope and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. The wire cutters bit through the chain link with a sound like breaking bones. Each cut felt like severing more than metal. It was cutting the ties that bound Jed to the safe, predictable life he'd built since Martha's death. Cutting away the illusion that doing the right thing and following the rules were the same. Sierra watched from her shelter as he worked, her amber eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight like twin stars in the pre-dawn darkness. When the opening was finally large enough, Jed stepped back and waited. This was the moment of truth, the test that would reveal whether their weeks together had created something resembling trust or merely the tolerance of a predator for her keeper. Sierra could bolt through the gap and disappear into the forest, leaving him behind with nothing but an empty pen and the certainty that federal agents would find exactly what they were looking for. But Sierra didn't run. She approached the opening cautiously, testing the air with her nose, examining the cut edges of the fence with the careful attention of an animal who had learned not to trust apparent escapes. When she finally stepped through the gap, she moved with the fluid grace that marked her as something born for spaces larger than any human could create. For a moment, Sierra stood in the open clearing between the pen and the forest, her head raised to catch scents that had been beyond her reach for months. The night air carried messages that Jed couldn't read, territorial markings from other predators, the movement patterns of prey animals, the complex chemical vocabulary of a world she'd been separated from too long. Then she looked back at Jed, and in that look was a question as clear as if she'd spoken it aloud. "Are you coming?" The answer came from a place deeper than rational thought. Jed picked up the pack he'd prepared and followed Sierra into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind the life he'd known for nearly 7 decades. Behind them, his cabin sat empty, the cut fence marking the place where 2 desperate creatures had chosen uncertainty over safety, hope over resignation. They traveled through the night, Sierra moving with the confident navigation of an animal returning to familiar territory, Jed following with the steady endurance of a man who'd spent his life in these mountains, but never with stakes this high. The terrain was rough, rising steadily toward the alpine country where Sierra had once ruled 60 square miles of wilderness as the apex predator. By dawn, they were 15 miles from the cabin, high enough that the air had taken on the thin quality that spoke of serious elevation. Sierra had set a pace that tested even Jed's mountain-hardened endurance, but her urgency was unmistakable. This wasn't just escape. This was a mother's desperate journey toward a reunion that might no longer be possible. As the sun crested the peaks ahead of them, Sierra stopped at the edge of a high meadow and made the sound Jed had heard twice before, the low, mournful call of a mother seeking her children. The sound echoed off the surrounding ridges, carrying farther than any human voice could reach, a signal that said, "I'm here. I'm alive. I'm looking for you." They waited in the meadow for nearly an hour, listening for any response from the vast landscape around them. The morning was filled with the ordinary sounds of mountain wildlife, bird calls, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant sound of water running over stone. But there was no answering call from juvenile mountain lions who might recognize their mother's voice. Jed watched Sierra's face as she processed the silence. There was no visible disappointment, no obvious grief, just the focused determination of a predator adjusting tactics when the first approach yielded no results. She began moving again, this time toward a series of rocky outcrops that rose from the meadow like ancient monuments. The rocks were granite, worn smooth by millennia of weather, but still offering the kind of vertical terrain that mountain lions preferred for denning and shelter. As they climbed higher, Jed began to see signs of habitation, scratches in the stone that spoke of claws finding purchase, scent markings that his untrained nose couldn't detect, but that Sierra investigated with obvious interest. Near the top of the largest outcrop, Sierra stopped and began to examine a depression in the rock that had been enlarged and shaped by generations of use. It was a den site, perfectly positioned to offer both shelter and a commanding view of the surrounding territory. The depression was just large enough for an adult mountain lion and several cubs, and the approaches to it could be defended against any threat except human beings with tranquilizer guns. Sierra's behavior at the den site was different from anything Jed had observed during their months together. She moved through the space with the careful attention of someone reading a story written in scents and marks invisible to human senses. Her investigation was thorough, systematic, and increasingly urgent. Then she froze, her head raised and her entire body rigid with attention. She had found something, some trace, some sign that meant more to her than all the GPS. Coordinates and trail camera footage could mean to the humans who studied these mountains from a distance. Sierra looked back at Jed with an expression that needed no translation. Her cubs had been here, in this ancient den where mountain lions had raised their young for countless generations. Whether they were still alive, whether they could be found, whether this journey would end in reunion or heartbreak, none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that Sierra was home, standing in the place where she belonged, free to search for her children in the mountains that held their only chance of survival. The scent trail was 3 days old, maybe 4, but Sierra followed it with the focused intensity of a mother who had found her first real hope in months. She moved through the rocky terrain with a confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity, leading Jed along paths that existed only in the memory of an animal who had traveled these routes with cubs, learning to navigate their inheritance. The trail led down from the den site through a series of natural corridors between the granite outcrops, then along a game trail that had been carved by generations of elk and deer moving to water. Jed's GPS showed they were heading toward a creek system that fed into one of the larger rivers. Prime hunting territory for a family of mountain lions who knew how to work together. As they descended, Sierra's behavior grew increasingly animated. She paused frequently to investigate scent marks, scratch patterns on trees, and disturbances in the undergrowth that told stories Jed could only guess at. Each sign seemed to confirm something she needed to know, building a narrative of survival that had played out in her absence. The creek, when they reached it, was running high with late spring runoff, the water crystal clear and cold enough to make Jed's teeth ache when he knelt to drink. Sierra ignored the water entirely, her attention fixed on a series of muddy banks where tracks were preserved like pages in a book, written in a language older than human speech. There, pressed into the soft earth at the water's edge, were the unmistakable pawprints of juvenile mountain lions. Not one set of tracks, but 2. Cubs that had survived the winter, grown larger and stronger, learned to hunt and move through this territory without their mother's guidance. The tracks were fresh, maybe hours old, leading upstream toward the kind of sheltered valley where prey animals came to drink and predators came to hunt. Sierra's response to finding the tracks was immediate and profound. She made a sound Jed had never heard from her, not the mournful call of a searching mother, but something that carried joy and urgency and desperate hope. It was the sound of recognition, of a parent who had found proof that the children she'd lost were not only alive but thriving. Without waiting to see if Jed would follow, Sierra plunged into the creek and began moving upstream with the powerful grace of an animal who had found her purpose. The water was knee-deep on Jed and swift enough to require careful footing. But Sierra moved through it as easily as she might cross a meadow, her focus entirely on the trail that promised reunion. They followed the creek for nearly a mile, climbing steadily toward a hanging valley that opened between two towering peaks. The tracks appeared regularly in the soft earth along the banks, sometimes joined by the larger paw prints of adult elk or deer, telling the story of a hunting ground that had supported Sierra's cubs through their first winter of independence. The valley, when they reached it, was everything a mountain lion could want, sheltered from the worst weather, supplied with running water, and populated with the kind of prey animals that could sustain a small predator family. Ancient pines provided cover and denning sites, while open meadows offered visibility for spotting both threats and opportunities. Sierra stopped at the valley's entrance and made her call again, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks with a clarity that seemed to fill the entire mountain landscape. This time, there was an answer. It came from the far end of the valley, carried on the thin mountain air like a sound from another world. Two voices, young but strong, responding to their mother's call with the unmistakable vocal signature of her offspring. Sierra's cubs had not only survived, they had grown into adolescent predators capable of living independently, but still young enough to recognize and respond to the mother they'd lost. The reunion, when it happened, was both more and less dramatic than Jed had imagined. Sierra moved toward the sound of her cubs' voices with purposeful determination, while two tawny shapes emerged from the trees at the valley's far end with the cautious curiosity of young animals who had learned to be wary of the unexpected. The cubs, no longer cubs. Really? But adolescent mountain lions, nearly two-thirds their mother's size, approached slowly, their body language speaking of the tension between recognition and uncertainty. They had survived months without their mother, had learned to hunt and fight and navigate the mountain landscape on their own. The question that hung in the air was whether that independence had severed the bonds of family or merely tested them. Sierra stopped perhaps 50 yards from her offspring, her own posture careful and non-threatening. She made a series of soft sounds, not the mournful calls of the searching mother, but the complex vocalizations of a predator re-establishing communication with family members who had grown and changed in her absence. The response came from the larger of the two cubs, a young male whose markings clearly identified him as Sierra's son. He approached cautiously, testing the air with his nose, his movements carrying the confident grace of an animal who had earned his survival through skill and determination. When he was close enough, he pressed his forehead against his mother's neck in the greeting ritual of mountain lions, acknowledging family bonds that had endured separation and hardship. The second cub, smaller and more cautious, watched this reunion from a safe distance before deciding that the strange human who accompanied their mother was not an immediate threat. When she finally approached Sierra, the family was complete again, not unchanged by their months apart, but whole in the way that mattered most. Standing in that high mountain valley, watching a mother mountain lion reunited with the cubs everyone had assumed were dead, Jed felt something shift in his chest that went deeper than satisfaction or relief. This was what redemption looked like, not the grand gestures of heroes in stories, but the quiet moment when choices made in hope rather than certainty revealed their true worth. 3 months later, Jed sat on a ridge overlooking the valley where he'd witnessed Sierra's reunion with her cubs, watching the morning mist rise from the creek that had led them home. His temporary camp was hidden in a grove of ancient pines, positioned where he could observe the mountain lion family without interfering with their return to wild patterns of living. The federal investigation had played out exactly as expected. Agents had arrived at his cabin to find an empty pen and no sign of either Jed or Sierra. The official report concluded that the missing research animal had likely died in captivity and that the elderly man who'd purchased her had probably panicked and disposed of the evidence when he realized the legal implications of his actions. The case was filed under wildlife trafficking, subject deceased, and forgotten by everyone except Jake Morrison, who occasionally wondered what had really happened to the mountain lion he'd never had the chance to help, Tom. Brennan had been questioned extensively, but maintained that his last contact with Jed had been a routine welfare check that revealed nothing unusual. The game warden's performance during the federal interviews was masterful, displaying just the right combination of cooperation and ignorance to satisfy investigators. While protecting information they didn't need to know. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins received an anonymous letter 3 weeks after the investigation closed, informing her that female 47 had been reunited with 2 surviving offspring in her original territory. The letter included GPS coordinates for observation posts and detailed behavioral notes that could only have come from someone with extensive experience watching predator families in the wild. The research team resumed their monitoring from a respectful distance, documenting the successful reintegration of a breeding female they'd thought was lost forever. Sierra and her cubs had adapted to their reunion with the fluid grace that marked them as creatures, designed for survival rather than sentiment. The months of separation had changed all of them. Sierra was more cautious than before, her cubs more independent, but the essential bonds of family had proven stronger than the forces that had tried to break them. Jed watched them hunt, together with the coordinated precision that only came from genetic memory and careful instruction. Sierra was teaching her offspring techniques they'd missed during her captivity, while they showed her innovations they'd developed during their months of independent survival. It was education flowing both ways, the kind of knowledge transfer that had allowed mountain lions to thrive in these mountains for thousands of years. Before human interference complicated their lives, the cubs had grown into magnificent predators in their own right. The male, whom Jed had privately named Ranger, was nearly as large as his mother and displayed the confident territorial behavior of a young cat ready to claim his own hunting grounds. His sister, smaller but faster, showed the hunting intelligence that would make her a successful mother when her time came to raise cubs of her own. From his observation post, Jed could see the subtle signs that the family would soon separate naturally. Ranger was already ranging farther from his mother and sister, investigating territory that would eventually become his domain. It was the normal progression of mountain lion life, the ancient pattern that ensured genetic diversity and territorial coverage across the vast landscape they called home. His own future was less clear, but somehow more peaceful than it had been in years. The cabin near Whitefish was officially his until the county decided what to do with the property of a man who had simply vanished. His savings were exhausted, but his needs had simplified to the basics of shelter, food, and the tools necessary for life in the wilderness. He'd become what he'd always been meant to be, not a trapper or a keeper of wild animals, but simply a man who understood mountains and chose to live among them on their terms rather than his own. The letter he'd written to Dr. Hawkins wasn't his only correspondence during those months. He'd also written to Sarah Chen, explaining Sierra's recovery and expressing gratitude for the veterinary care that had made everything else possible. He'd written to Jake Morrison, apologizing for the wasted trip and the false hope that Sierra would need sanctuary care. Most importantly, he'd written to Martha's sister in Billings, asking her to tend Martha's grave and explaining that he'd found the peace Martha had always hoped he'd discover before it was too late. As autumn approached and the aspen leaves began their annual transformation from green to gold, Jed made his final observations of the mountain lion family he'd helped reunite. Sierra had grown sleek and confident again, her coat gleaming with the health that came from successful hunting in familiar territory. Her cubs carried themselves with the dignity of young predators who had survived their first real test and emerged stronger. On a crisp October morning, Jed watched Sierra and her cubs make their formal farewell to each other. It was subtle. No dramatic gestures or extended ceremonies, just the gradual separation that marked the end of one phase of their lives and the beginning of another. Ranger disappeared into the high country to establish his own territory. His sister remained with Sierra for another week before she too departed, heading toward the southern reaches of what had once been their shared domain. Sierra spent 3 days alone in the valley where she'd been reunited with her cubs, reacquainting herself with the solitude that had defined most of her adult life before motherhood changed everything. Then she too began to move, not with the desperate urgency of a mother seeking lost children, but with the measured purpose of a mature predator claiming her rightful place in the mountain ecosystem. Jed's last sight of Sierra came on a morning when the first snow was dusting the high peaks with winter's promise. She stood on the same rocky outcrop where he'd first seen her examine her ancient den. But now she was looking not backward toward loss and captivity, but forward toward whatever territories and opportunities awaited her in the vast wilderness that had always been her true home. In that moment, watching a mountain lion survey her domain with the confidence of an animal that belonged exactly where she was, Jed understood that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic reversals. It was about the quiet restoration of things to their proper places, wild animals in wild spaces, broken spirits made whole, and the simple recognition that sometimes the most important freedom is the freedom to go home.